Fritz Witt's trip had not been in vain. The prostitutes he found in Paris were installed in a hotel close to Company HQ. Evidently, he had reached the conclusion that it would be better for his soldiers to visit a properly run establishment rather than pick up local prostitutes and risk infection with a sexually transmitted disease. After all, a sick soldier is not a fighting soldier. With my 19th birthday only a few months away, I decided it was time to lose my virginity. By the time I turned into the street where the hotel was located, my nerves were jangling, my legs turning to jelly. 2 men from another company were hanging around the door of the hotel smoking cigarettes. They spotted me. It was too late to turn back. I handed my rifle to the UVD inside the doorway and went into the restaurant. Girls milled around, exchanging touches and smiles with the Waffen-SS men sitting at the tables. The atmosphere was relaxed, the room filled with the over-loud babbling of the intoxicated visitors. I went to the bar to order a beer. The full-bosomed barmaid smiled. "Ah, a new customer. How old are you?" 18. As she leaned forward to fetch a bottle of beer from beneath the counter, she caught me staring at her décolleté. "Are you looking for a girl?" The word sent a tingle of excitement surging through every nerve in my body. All I had to do now was say "ja." I looked her straight in the eyes to give my reply, but all that came out of my mouth was a frog-like croak. A wave of the barmaid's hand brought a woman of about 30 to my side. "This is the Puff Mutter," said the barmaid. "She'll fix you up with a girl." Hands on hips, the Puff Mutter looked me up and down. "I have just the right girl for you," she said, beckoning me to follow. "You don't need to look any further." In a whirl, I found myself paying the fee for a green ticket on which was written a room number and a girl's name, Yvonne. The Puff Mutter ushered me to a medical orderly sitting at a desk at the foot of a flight of stairs. He thrust a freshly laundered towel into my hand. "Show me your ticket," he yawned. He glanced at it and granted himself a lazy smile. "Ah, Yvonne, she's nice," he said, recording her name on a form. "First time?" I nodded. "Show me your condom." I fumbled inside my tunic and pulled out one of my 3 standard-issue condoms. "When you're finished, I want to see that filled. Don't throw it away." I nodded again, this time noticing a shallow tray draped with a white cloth on the desk. "Room 9. You have 15 minutes, he said, and with a sideways jerk of his head, signalled for me to go upstairs. Hardly enough time, I thought, as I made every effort to refrain from running up the steps. Breathless with excitement, I hurried along the dimly lit corridor looking for the designated number. With white knuckles, I rattled on the door of room 9. The lock clicked, and the door opened to reveal a pretty young woman. I showed her my ticket, wondering if I was in a dream. It was the girl who had sung so beautifully in the bar in Paris, but naively I was disappointed when she showed no sign that she had recognized me. I mumbled, "Yvonne?" "Oui," she said, reaching out to take my hand to lead me to a double bed in the corner of the dingy room. "Give me your condom and take off your clothes," she said, in a way that suggested this was no more than a perfectly rehearsed stock phrase in a language that was completely foreign to her. As I undressed, Yvonne undid the tie of her chiffon nightdress to reveal her small, conical breasts. I had never seen a naked woman before, let alone stripped off in front of one. Even before I had removed my underwear, I was fully primed, ready to enjoy my first sexual encounter. Yvonne sat on the edge of the bed and took the condom from its packing. With cool fingertips, she slowly unrolled the rubber over my penis, the only prelude to an act of mating that was otherwise without the usual rituals of love. In less than 5 minutes, I had performed the deed that broke my virginity. But, as they say, you never forget your first time. At the foot of the stairs, I held the used condom between my thumb and forefinger to allow the medic to peer at it. Satisfied it had been properly used, he reached under his desk to fetch a small bucket and raised it towards me. I let the thing drop to join the slimy mass of rubber already lining the bottom of the container. "Now drop your trousers," ordered the medic, as he slipped the bucket under the desk. With a deft movement of his hand, he whisked away the cloth covering the waiting tray to reveal a large syringe filled with an ominous brown liquid. Before I had time to think, he gripped my penis and thrust the blunt needle deep into my urethra. I winced as he slowly squeezed the plunger of the syringe, forcing the liquid, a sulfonamide solution, into me. It was a most unpleasant feeling. "You'll be fine in an hour or so," assured the medic when the procedure was complete. He franked the form on his desk with the date and location of the bordello. Handing it to me, he said, "Now listen carefully. Don't lose this. Put it in your Soldbuch. It proves you have been properly sanitized. If you come down with anything nasty, you must show it to your company doctor. Keep it for 10 weeks. Just days before Christmas, 1942, Ehlers and I were ordered to report to a local garage late in the evening where we were to work through the night to avoid disrupting the garage's usual work. We arrived to find half a dozen vehicles belonging to our company parked in the yard. Inside the garage, the owner stood impatiently beside one of our trucks, its lights and windows taped over, ready to give a 10-minute lesson in spray painting. "It looks like we're heading for Africa," said Ehlers as we sprayed the first truck with sand-coloured paint. "Well, Benjamin, they say it gets hot enough to fry eggs on the tank turrets," I quipped, "but at least we won't be tortured and killed if we are captured by the British." Our work in the garage lasted several nights. Intoxicated by the fumes of the cellulose paint thinners and the thought of the heat of North Africa, we sprayed the final vehicle. As we cleaned the spray guns, the growl of a truck engine outside rattled the rusting corrugated iron sheets that formed the door of the garage. The driver came in carrying the first of a dozen canisters of paint. "The colour's been changed. You've to start repainting the trucks white without delay. Looks like it's back to the Ostfront for us." The men in our company treated the news of our impending return to the Ostfront with magnanimity. After all, we were the Führer's elite regiment, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. We took orders without complaint, fought with honour. My brother and his fiancée had decided to hold their wedding on Christmas Day 1942. I had been granted leave to attend the ceremony in Berlin and was looking forward to the event. However, my fame as a baker had evidently spread among the officers, and Waldmüller asked if I would mind preparing a Christmas treat for the whole of 4, company. It seemed fate had me marked out as a baker, and once more I agreed to a request. Being a very fair man, Hans Waldmüller assured me that my leave had been deferred rather than lost. During the 3 days in the run-up to Christmas, I prepared a treat of cakes and cookies for the men in 4, company, while the French bakers carried on their work at night, as usual. Unfortunately, I developed a rash on my hands from the exposure to yeast and dough. Knowing that soldiers with an infection of any sort were not allowed home leave, I put this prospect to the back of my mind and enjoyed the most memorable Christmas party of my life, a happy time spent in the company of Kameraden with whom I had shared so many dangers. We dined like royalty in the chateau with roast piglet and plenty of accompaniments such as roast potatoes and vegetables on offer. Heinz König, we discovered to our surprise, was an excellent piano player and provided non-stop entertainment. The day after Christmas, I reported to the company doctor. Although the rash had improved with only a slight redness remaining between my fingers, he refused to sign my pass. I had already missed Horst's wedding, and the prospect of having no leave at all I knew would break my mother's heart. She had not seen me since I left Lichterfelde Barracks in the summer of 1941. When I mentioned my lost leave to Hauptsturmführer Waldmüller, he was sympathetic to my plight. "Give me the pass and don't mention this to anyone," he said. "I was once a police detective." With a satisfied grin, he handed me the pass with the forged signature of the doctor, without explaining anything of the circumstances in which this devious skill would be necessary in the course of his duties as a detective. I bought a bottle of Calvados at the canteen before making my way to the rail station in Évreux on the evening of Monday, the 28th of December. It seemed half the Wehrmacht garrison had gathered there to catch the same train. It was a struggle to push my way into a carriage, and I had to stand all the way to Berlin, a journey that took more than 12 hours. By chance, my mother was looking out the open window of our flat as I made my way along Strausberger Strasse. She slammed the window down, and despite the icy breeze, reappeared on the street without her coat. "Oh, Erby, it's been such a long time," she sobbed through tears of joy as she ran to me. "Your father and I were so worried about you. I hope that phone call from Horst didn't get you into trouble. I put him up to it, you know." "No, Mama, it didn't." When in Taganrog, more than a year earlier, I had been assigned to telephone duties at Company HQ when Horst had made the call. Because of the helter-skelter nature of our advance, I had not had the opportunity to write home, and my parents, fearing the worst, had asked Horst to use his position as a telephonist with the Air Ministry to try to get in touch with our company. By a miracle of effort, he managed to arrange the necessary connections. When I picked up the telephone, I handed it to one of our officers saying, "A call from Berlin." I almost fell from my stool when he handed the phone back saying the call was for me. To have heard Horst's voice from so far away, to know that he had taken so much trouble to get in contact with me, touched my heart, and for a few moments I had been overcome by a longing to be back in Berlin with my family. I put my arm around her shoulder and squeezed gently. "Mutti, it's good to be home." I spent a quiet New Year's Eve with my parents. On New Year's Day, we travelled in light snow to Erkner on the south side of Berlin to visit the home of Horst's new in-laws. Unfortunately, I had left my billet in France too soon to receive the usual Christmas gift of schnapps that the Führer, at his own expense, gave to every man in the Leibstandarte, a gesture of thanks repeated at Easter. However, I had a bottle of Calvados I had purchased before leaving France and took it with me as a present to our hosts. Horst, on leave from the Air Ministry, and his new wife arrived shortly after us with a present of biscuits and cakes. We spent a fine day exchanging family tales before returning to Berlin. "Son, waken up. There's an urgent telegram for you." I rubbed my eyes. It was already halfway through the first day of 1943. "What does it say?" "You have to return to your company on the 4th of January. Did that mean I had to leave for France on that date, or did I have to be there in 3 days? My father and I were of the opinion that I should leave immediately, but my brother Horst, who visited later that afternoon, said I should wait until the 4th, since there would be hardly any trains running over the weekend. In the end, I decided there was enough ambiguity in the instruction for me to remain with my family for 3 more days. I reported to the guard at the Schlesischer Bahnhof on the morning of the 4th of January, and was relieved to see another soldier from our company already waiting on the platform. Soon another turned up, then another. Finally, there were 8 of us looking for transport back to our unit in France. Since there were no trains available, we reported to our barracks in Lichterfelde, where we hung around for a day before being sent to the Magdeburg barracks, where a Totenkopf unit was awaiting transport to Russia. On arrival in Magdeburg, we made sure our papers were made up to date to prevent any difficulties that might arise if we were stopped by the police, an important issue because we had to account for our whereabouts at all times. Again, we were forced to hang around for a few hours before being told we could catch a train that was due to leave from Berlin the following day. We were in a sort of limbo where no one was responsible for us, and had had nothing to eat or drink the whole day. In desperation, we took our packs to my parents' home for safekeeping, before deciding to make our way to the Oranienburg concentration camp, about an hour's train ride to the north, where we knew of a canteen that served meals to the guards from the Totenkopf division. We made our presence known to the officers there, and explained that we needed provisions for our trip back to our unit. They gave us food and drink, including bottles of schnapps and 2 large cartons of cigarettes. Since we had no money, we had to sign for the provisions, but who eventually paid for them, I shall never know. We left Oranienburg to spend the night at my family home, where we pushed my parents' beds together. It was not unusual at that time for married couples to sleep in separate beds, and 4 of us slept head to tail across them, while the remainder of my Kameraden and my parents spent the night on the floor. The next day we travelled to Evreux and arrived there to see a train loaded with white camouflaged vehicles departing from a platform on the opposite side of the station. A few inquires soon revealed that it was the train taking our regiment back to Russia. Luckily, we were able to hitch a ride with another train that left a few days later. As the days dragged by, the landscape grew inexorably whiter until sometime around the middle of January 1943, our train came to a halt at Poltava in the Ukraine. Without leaving the station, I managed to find another train carrying a panzer unit heading for the sector where 4. Company was in position. After a few hours, it came to a halt at a desolate little station where the panzer unit unloaded their vehicles, many of which, as if in complaint against the bitter cold, were reluctant to start. I went from vehicle to vehicle asking the drivers if they were heading for the sector where 4. Company was stationed but was out of luck. As the trucks and armoured vehicles disappeared down a snowy track, I was left with no choice but to wait until morning with the remaining 50 or so men from the panzer unit. A hard frost set in as the sun, as pale as a full moon, sank into the thin cloud that had settled over the vast, dazzling landscape. My cheeks tingled in the cold air, a familiar feeling, as the encroaching darkness brought its icy stillness. The angry zip-zip of bullets shattered the wintry silence. Only the flashes of light from the muzzles of their weapons betrayed the position of our attackers. Suddenly, we found ourselves in a battle zone without a secure front line. "The bastards are less than half a kilometre away," yelled our only officer. "Set up a perimeter in the rail yard. We're sitting ducks on the platform." Somehow, we managed to reach the cover offered by some crates scattered in the rail yard without taking any casualties. After a few minutes, the enemy gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We waited, shivering, every German eye peering into the deepening gloom. A shout went up. "Ivan's by the track." I could just make out groups of ghost-like figures in white camouflage suits. Less than 100 meters away, they were maneuvering towards us through the deep snow. Our 2 machine guns opened up, breaking the silence of the night with their mechanical rattle. With no shortage of ammunition, we continued firing until there was no sign of movement near the track. Frost glittered on every surface as wolves, eyes glowing like white fire, ventured ever closer to the scent of spilled Russian blood. Pitiable whimpers followed the sharp crack of a rifle shot. Our faces blue with cold, we welcomed the return of the Panzer unit the following morning. A radio link was quickly established with 4 company, and an hour later a truck arrived to carry me to my unit. Despite the Russian attack at the rail station, I managed to hang on to the bottle of schnapps and several cartons of cigarettes I had picked up in Oranienburg, most of which I sold when I arrived at the company command post. I lodged my gains for safekeeping at the orderly's hut, but held on to a few packs of cigarettes and the bottle of schnapps to share with my Kameraden. Finally, I located my Kompanietrupp in a well-made bunker. Couldn't drag yourself away from that little French tart in the hotel, eh, Irvin? How are things back in Berlin? One after the other, my Kameraden shook my hand, slapped my back, laughed like excited schoolboys. At last I was home, and relieved to find there had been no further losses while I played catch-up. I passed round the bottle of schnapps, each man taking a hefty swig to fend off the cold, then rummaged under my camouflage jacket to find a full pack of cigarettes to press into Boris's hand. A wide grin flashed across his face. "I was beginning to think the Tommy bombers had dropped one on your head." "We were messed about in Berlin," I explained. "Sent here, there, everywhere before I managed to get a train to Evreux. Finally got a lift with a train carrying a Panzer unit, but you wouldn't believe how slow it was." Thinly spread on the hills overlooking the frozen River Donets. 4. Company defended a sector of the eastern approaches to Kharkov. I laid the necessary telephone connections, puppet strings as we called them, to link the scattered machine gun crews with the company command post. Alles gut. Within a few days of settling into my new position, the Russians began an artillery barrage during which the telephone connection with the command post was broken. It was my duty to repair the damage as quickly as possible, a dangerous task when under fire. I followed the cable from the front-line telephone through deep snow, my footsteps breaking unpredictably through the crusty surface. Rivulets of sweat trickled down my back and brow, panting out white clouds of breathed air that hung around my face in the still air. I came to the broken end of the cable, but the section leading to the command post was lost in the shell-churned snow. With bullets buzzing too close for comfort, I began a systematic search until I found the missing cable end, but it was too short to reach the wire from the front line, and I had to repair the gap with a length of cable taken from the drum I carried. I took the wire strippers from the leather pouch on my belt, knelt beside the broken cable, and took off my gloves. Before I had completed the first connection, my fingers were numb. I dropped the strippers, fumbled for them in the crystalline snow. As I worked on the second connection, my fingers were already blue and painful, almost too painful to manipulate my tools. When I completed the repair, I looked around to get my bearings and noticed a squad of Russians at a distance of around 100 meters. One of them called to me. I could hardly believe my eyes. The soldier was wearing a steel helmet and a skirt. And she wasn't the only one. The whole squad wore skirts. For some reason they withheld their fire, though I must have presented a tempting target. Yet again, my guardian angel had been by my side. Back in our cosy bunker, my Kameraden greeted the news of my encounter with a troop of women with calls of derision. The clever remarks came thick and fast. You must be desperate for a girl, Erwin. That little maid from Paris has gone to your head. Did you ask them for a date? I said you would go blind. Everyone laughed, and to tell the truth, I was beginning to doubt my own eyes. However, the following day they saw for themselves that I hadn't been spinning a crazy tale. Flares hissed into the deep black of the night sky, then burst with the radiance of 1,000,000 stars. Beneath the falling flares, the snowfields by the river Donets teemed with the ominous dark shadows of Russian infantry. Our platoon leader yelled, "Feuer frei!" Firing at will, our machine gunners put their recently issued MG-42S to lethal work. With their high rate of fire, they mowed down another night attack. By day, we came under constant artillery bombardment from the Ratch bums, as we called the Russian howitzers because of the characteristic sound of their fire. We feared these weapons because they fired high-velocity rounds that exploded a fraction of a second after the sound of the discharge reached our lines, allowing no time to dive for cover. Even more threatening was the sight of endless columns of Russian infantry, slithering like black snakes across the snowfields on the far side of the Donets, day after day, working their way around our southern flank to complete a deadly noose. Exhausted after days without proper sleep and very little food, it was clear we would not be able to hold out against the anticipated onslaught. In darkness, with temperatures below -30 degrees, we abandoned our well-prepared defence positions and made our way towards Rogan, a satellite town a few kilometres to the southeast of Kharkov. We had only just set up our defence perimeter through the centre of Rogan when the Russians appeared in force. At times, the storm of bullets was so thick it was impossible to look out over a window ledge or wall without risking a bullet through the head. T-34 tanks supported by infantry broke through our defences. After 3 days of continual fighting, it might have been 4, we withdrew to the open, hilly ground between Kharkov and Rogan, every one of us staggering on the very limits of endurance. On our right flank, across a ravine, 1 company was taking a terrible pounding on a hill overlooking the main road to Kharkov. Gradually, the Russians were pressing us closer to the city centre for the coup de grace. Fortunately, we were under the command of Papa Hauser. Having taken the lesson of Stalingrad taken to heart, he gave the order to pull back from the city. Just after midday on the 15th of February, a date I remember because it was the day after my parents' wedding anniversary, we escaped through a corridor only a few hundred metres wide, on the western edge of the city. Word spread soon after that Hauser, risking the severest of punishments, had saved our skins by his courageous decision to defy Hitler's order to hold Kharkov to the last man. To have a leader who cared about the men under his command was a great comfort to us. We knew he would never sacrifice us, seinen Jungs, his boys, to fulfill some futile order from above. By the beginning of March 1943, the situation had improved. A growing Russian threat to the south had been eliminated. We were on the move to retake Kharkov, desperate to inflict a telling wound on the enemy, resolute in our will to repay Papa Hauser for the loyalty he had shown us, determined to repay the Russians for our humiliating retreat just a few weeks earlier. With our fellow Waffen-SS formations, Das Reich and Totenkopf on our flanks, we pushed through a milky mist that obliterated the horizon, blurred the distinction between sky and ground. Every solid object took on a shade of grey, floated in a world without perspective or colour. Onwards we pushed day and night, stopping only to shovel snow from the wheels of vehicles that had lost the road. Where the Russians had offered resistance, their dead lay, ice caked around their eyes and mouths, faces locked in anguish by death's cold embrace. Here and there, frozen arms thrust stiffly through the snow as if summoning help. To me, they were no longer Bolsheviks, simply poor sods who had died defending their country. A flash came from the barrel of one of our new Tiger tanks, only a few meters to my right. Suddenly, the frenzied roar of battle disappeared. I had learned the hard way that the blast from a Tiger's powerful gun leaves through side vents, the recoil brake. The supersonic blast battered my eardrums, leaving me unable to hear the approach of vehicles, incoming shells, or the warning shouts of my Kameraden, a dangerous handicap on the battlefield. I was thankful when, after a few hours, my hearing slowly returned. Over snow-covered fields, red with the reflected light of ferocious combat, our Kampfgruppe Frey closed in on Kharkov along the main road connecting the city with Belgorod. Tracer bullets ignited the thatched roofs of cottages where we encountered resistance, the heat of the flames melting the ice on nearby picket fences. Steam rose from my uniform as I passed a burning windmill, its blades spinning madly as it flayed itself to death in a storm of swirling sparks. At first light, the Russians made a determined effort to stop our progress with a surprise attack across the open spaces of an airfield on the northern edge of the city. A few kilometers to my right, our Nebelwerfers showered the defenders with a storm of rockets. Ahead, our Tigers clashed with Russian T-34s, throwing off their attack with ease. Draped in the vivid red of our swastika flags, our half-tracks pushed closer to the city centre. Crouching at street corners, we watched our tank shells burst open buildings that served as nests of Russian resistance. Couriers on motorcycles raced back and forth with vital messages, their wheels churning the dirty, compacted snow. Deeper into the city, we found the defenders had barricaded the streets with burnt-out vehicles and tank traps, forcing our panzers to queue on the approach roads until our Pioneer Corps cleared the blockages. Street combat in winter was always a dangerous undertaking, but in Kharkov the perils were exceptional. Perhaps this had something to do with the layout of the town, or perhaps the enemy had developed new combat strategies. In either case, the Russians doggedly contested every house, every street corner. In places, knee-deep snow slowed our movement, adding to the danger on streets where sniper fire was a constant threat. As we fought from building to building, led by a wily Oberscharführer with whom we had fought many times, we came under small arms fire from a handful of Russians sheltering in the entrance of an apartment block. Our Oberscharführer was on the opposite side of the road and opened fire on them, forcing the Russians to scarper down the road. We gave chase and managed to loose off a few rounds as they disappeared into a building that might have been a factory or warehouse. Our Oberscharführer followed them into the building. We dashed across the road to catch up and found ourselves at the foot of a stairwell. Leaping several steps with every stride, we began a mad rush up the stairs. A metallic crash from above brought us to an abrupt halt. We looked at each other, our eyes silently agreeing to continue our charge irrespective of the danger. At the top of the stairwell, a heavy metal door barred our progress. Frantically, I tried the handle, but the door was locked. A camarade pushed me to the side and kicked at the door. I joined in the assault, timing the blows of my rifle butt to coincide with his kicks, but the heavily built door remained steadfastly shut. With the push into the centre of the city still going on outside, we had no choice but to abandon our rescue attempt. I can only guess at the fate of our Oberscharführer. We lost a fine camarade that day. On the second day in Kharkov, I received an order to report to the company command post. "Sturmmann Bartmann," said the officer in charge, "I have a little task for you." He handed me an envelope, saying earnestly, "This letter concerns the movement of ammunition. Make sure it gets to the supply depot. I'm sure you will understand that this mission is vital to our success in this battle." I had only a vague idea of the whereabouts of the supply unit from what I had seen as we fought our way into the city. "Untersturmführer, where exactly should I deliver the letter?" The Untersturmführer screwed up his face and shook his head. Then, without any further words of explanation, gave a vague wave of his hand. "I trust you'll find it." Darkness was falling as I began my journey along streets where vicious fighting had raged the whole day. Time after time, so it seemed to me, I got the risky jobs. I swallowed my irritation. An order had been issued, and it was my duty to execute it irrespective of the risk. Keeping to any cover that was at hand, I passed by buildings with blown-out windows, good vantage points for lurking snipers. After several kilometers, following in reverse the route we took earlier in the day, I reached the outskirts of the city. A dim light came from a lonely house set back from the roadside, and I wondered whether I should knock on the door to ask the occupants for directions. A moment's consideration led me to the conclusion that such exploration would be too perilous for a solitary soldier. I decided to press on through the darkness until I eventually came to a fork in the road. Which branch should I take? I hesitated for a moment before deciding to carry on to the right. After walking another kilometre along the deserted road, the dark figures of soldiers formed in the gloom. Were they Russians or Germans? I stood rooted to the spot. One of the figures moved towards me, waving a hand, signalling for me to come forward. A Russian voice called, A cold shiver rippled through my spine. Though my heart was pounding, I kept quiet and turned as nonchalantly as possible to make my escape on shaking legs. The Russian called once more, but I ignored him and carried on back the way I had come. Yet again, my guardian angel had been by my side. When I reached the junction, I took the left fork. Before long, the outlines of vehicles formed in the eerie, faint blue light thrown up by the snow. This time I was more careful and crept forward until I could identify them as German. I shouted the password, Morgenstund. A nervous sentry let me advance, then an adjutant escorted me to the commanding officer's quarters, where we found him fast asleep. The adjutant shook the officer's shoulder. "Obersturmführer, I'm sorry to have to waken you, but there's an urgent message for you concerning the supply of ammunition." Bleary-eyed, the Obersturmführer took the letter from my outstretched hand and began to read. "Scheiße!" he cursed. "I'll have to move the whole garrison." Staggering from his bed to grab his tunic, he turned on his adjutant. "Well, don't just stand there. Get the men ready to move." I hitched a lift with them to the junction, then returned on foot to my company command post. When I recounted my adventure to the officer who had sent me on this dangerous errand, he simply replied, "You were lucky." A board the size of a tabletop hung on a lamppost in Kharkov's town square. It carried the neatly hand-painted words, Platz der Leibstandarte. That the renaming of a town square in the Ukraine in this manner, an apparently meagre token, should have filled me with pride may seem absurd now, but it represented praise from commanders for whom I had the greatest respect. Commanders who did not hide from the dangers their men faced. Though the Leibstandarte had suffered thousands of casualties, I had come through the battle for Kharkov unscathed. The notion of a guardian angel was no longer simply a synonym for good luck. I was convinced such entities existed, and that one of them had chosen me as a companion. After our victory in Kharkov, we withdrew to the west, to Olshany, where our Pioneer Corps set up piping hot showers and a delousing facility. Just to feel clean was one of life's great pleasures for a soldier on the Ostfront. A period of rest and recovery followed, a sure sign we were being fattened up for yet another titanic struggle. On one occasion, we had the choice of visiting the Soldatenheim in Kharkov, where girls plied their trade, or the Opera House. I elected to visit the opera where Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov was playing. Performed by an excellent cast and well attended by our troops, it was a welcome respite from the hazards of war. As a break from normal routine, our officers arranged a shooting competition between teams from different platoons. A nearby ravine with a cliff at one end provided a safe site to test our shooting skills. Stray shots would cause no damage here. Targets were set up at 100, 200 and 500 meters. The prize was a box of cigars donated by an officer. Only the 6 best marksmen from each platoon were allowed to compete for this prize. Obersturmführer Fritz Lotter, our youthful company chief at that time, was the first to demonstrate his skills before the competition got properly underway. Then, one by one, the members of each team took their turn. I was pleasantly surprised to find that I came second behind Lotter, with my score for 500 meters being particularly good. A football match pitting NCOs against officers extended the spirit of friendly competition. Having no football strips to identify the teams, the NCOs played stripped to their waists and long johns. An attractive Ukrainian woman in colourful traditional headdress welcomed Ehlers, Bruder, Koenig and me into her house, our billet, with the customary offering of bread and salt. Although still young with a complexion as fresh as a sunflower, she looked after us like a mother, preparing our meals and washing our clothes. Her German was good enough for her to be able to tell us that her husband was a pilot in the Soviet Air Force. She slept in the only bedroom while we shared the front room, the window of which looked out to the house where our battalion headquarters had been set up, on the other side of the road. Though at first he contrived secretly to be alone with her, it soon became obvious that a relationship was developing between Bruder, our driver, and our Ukrainian hostess. As he was leaving the house one morning to carry out some routine maintenance work on the truck, he announced that he would be spending the night in the bedroom with her. "Promise me, all of you, that you won't disturb us tonight," he pleaded. We chanted in unison, "We promise." As soon as Bruder left, Ehlers began a search of the cupboards. "What luck! Our pretty little hostess makes jam," he declared, gleefully grabbing a handful of empty jars. All I need now is a ball of string to tie them to the bed springs. That evening, Bruder smiled broadly as he went hand in hand with our hostess into the bedroom. Ehlers threatened to giggle, but Koenig slapped a hand over Ehlers' mouth before he lost control. Hardly able to contain our mirth, we listened and waited. Before too long, a single chink of glass against glass came from the bedroom, then silence. "Scheisse! He's found them," whispered Ehlers, whose disappointment was quickly dispelled by a chorus of splendid chimes as jars containing differing amounts of water struck each other under the bed next door. Bruder burst angrily from the bedroom, but his protests drowned in our howls of laughter. It took our driver several days to see the funny side of Ehlers' prank. Life was good in Olszany until tragedy struck one afternoon as I took a message into the battalion headquarters. Attracted by frantic screams, I turned to see two women amidst a crowd of children, grappling with a heavy German motorcycle that had fallen over. The dispatch rider, who happened to be leaving the headquarters, pushed past me and stormed into the crowd where two women, hands pressed to their cheeks, looked on in horror. I followed on behind to see what had happened. "Verdammt, there's a kid under it," groaned the dispatch rider as he hoisted the motorcycle onto its parking stand. A woman lunged towards the child, a boy of 6 or 7, and in a frantic effort to revive the youngster, slapped his face. Her fruitless efforts ended with a cry of grief that struck into my heart like a sword. She took the limp body in her arms and rocked it like a baby, crying, "Kolya, Kolya." Attracted by the commotion, women from the houses nearby quickly gathered around the dispatch rider, screaming at the tops of their voices as they flung their fists at him. In vain, he tried to explain that his machine must have fallen while the boy was playing on it. Sturmbannführer Frey organized a coffin for the youngster and issued orders for us to keep off the streets while the funeral took place in a nearby Catholic church. As we drove northwards towards Bielgorod, the ecstasy of victory shone in the faces of my kameraden. Seduced into a delusion of invulnerability by mere survival, we had forgotten with ease the ghosts left to roam the ruins of Kharkov, forgotten too that capricious fortune was the arbiter of life and death. Our column came to a halt in the shelter of a deep ravine. Clouds of dust settled around us as an Oberscharführer made his way to the side of our truck and called, "Sturmann Bartmann and you, Koenig, scout out to the end of this ravine and tell us if Ivan is waiting for us. We don't want to drive straight into a trap. It's not suitable terrain for laying telephone cable. If you spot anything, get your asses back here at the double." There was a mocking quality to his voice, as if he took delight in assigning this dangerous task to my young companion and me. We trotted along the road, glancing back occasionally to judge the distance we had travelled. Soon our column was lost behind the lush buttresses sweeping down from the high ridges on either side of the ravine. We were alone in enemy territory, ambush territory. After a couple of kilometres, we stopped to recover our breath at a spot where the rift in the landscape opened into a wide valley. "No sign of Ivan," said Koenig, pushing his helmet to the back of his head to wipe the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his tunic. "No sign. But they have snipers that have had plenty practice. We'd never be able to spot them, too well camouflaged." I pointed to a lonely haystack in an open field. "We'll take cover in there and make some observations." Koenig, now 20 metres ahead of me, was near the haystack when the sound of an approaching aircraft came from behind. He turned to look at the sky. "Don't worry," I shouted casually. "You'll soon get to know the sound of Russian engines. I don't recognize the type," yelled Koenig, ducking. The knee-high grass swayed in the wake of the plane. "Heinkel 112. After swooping in a wide curve, the Heinkel made a second, head-on approach. Koenig waved, but instinct warned me the pilot was lining up to attack. "Take cover," I screamed as I threw myself to the ground. Koenig dived into the haystack so that only his feet were visible. Bloody ostrich, I thought, laughing aloud. The Heinkel's machine guns flashed. Spurts of dirt kicked up from the ground. The whir of ricochets with different notes was almost musical. Then something whipped against my leg, high up at the front of my thigh, which was odd because I was lying face down on the ground. As the din of the aircraft's engine faded, there was movement in the haystack. Koenig's feet disappeared, and a moment later his head popped out from the straw. Meine Fresse. That was close. He let go a whistle of relief. Closer than you think, I said, easing myself to my feet. My legs trembled, but there was no pain. The impossible had happened. I had been hit. Koenig, covered in straw, ran over to me. He fumbled inside his tunic pocket for a first-aid dressing. It's not too bad. It doesn't look too bad. He sounded even more scared than I felt. I reached down to the wound and pressed gently. The bullet must have hit a rock and travelled parallel to the ground, I said, subduing the shock. My fingers found a reassuring bulge. The bullet had lodged under my skin without striking the thigh bone. Blood now ran freely down my right leg, soaking the front of my uniform trousers. I took the dressing from Koenig and bound the wound as best I could before we made our way back to the ravine. Spooked by the Heinkel's machine gun fire, our unit was in a state of high alert with every gun pointing in our direction as we approached. Koenig shouted the password. When the Oberscharführer saw my blood-soaked leg, he immediately summoned the ambulance from rear of our column. Inside the ambulance, I gritted my teeth as the medical orderly swabbed the gash with a liberal dose of iodine solution. I tried not to wince as his forceps probed inside my leg. After all, it had been drilled into us in Lichterfelde. Pain is in the brain. Just a flesh wound, said the medic, holding up a bullet for me to see. It'll heal in a few days. Keep it covered to cut down the risk of infection. Now, how did it happen? I recounted the details of the Heinkel's attack. Ah, that's a pity. You can't put your name forward for a wound badge because it wasn't caused by enemy fire. I'll write that in my report. My Kameraden in the Kompanietrupp found the sight of my wound highly amusing. A few centimetres to the side and it could have destroyed my ability to father children, but for me it was certainly no laughing matter. It caused considerable pain and made it impossible for me to sit comfortably in a moving vehicle. A pain in the groin, I discovered, was certainly not in the brain, and guardian angels are not in constant attendance. A week or so after my wound, an Oberscharführer assembled a reconnaissance unit to establish the exact whereabouts of the Russian defences. Under a clear blue sky, we set off into the unknown, beyond our front lines. I sat in the sidecar of a motorcycle driven by a Rottenführer. With his machine pistol on my knees and an expensive camera and telephoto lens between my feet, we led the way along a winding road with 3 of our cars following a half a kilometre behind. At the crest of a steep rise in the road, the Rottenführer slammed on the brakes, bringing the motorcycle to an abrupt halt. For a moment we sat in silence, our eyes and mouths wide open as we stared at an anti-tank gun pointing threateningly in our direction. The Rottenführer cut the engine. They would have let us have one by now if it was manned, he said. Let's take a look. I glanced back to see our 3 cars motionless at the bottom of the slope and handed my companion his machine pistol as I stepped from the sidecar. As we approached the anti-tank gun, a movement in a field to the side of the road caught my eye. I tapped the Rottenführer on the shoulder and pointed into the field. Verdammt, they're having a brew-up. At that moment, the astonished faces of 6 Russians turned to gape at us for an instant, before they realized we were German. We spun on our heels to make a dash for the motorbike as the Russians made a dash for their gun. It was a race against time with another lucky escape as first prize. Panting with the effort of running uphill, I jumped into the sidecar. The Rottenführer heaved on the kickstart. The engine gave a token chug-chug, then stopped. Still, the Russians had not managed to loose off a shell. Again, the Rottenführer stamped on the kickstart, but the engine steadfastly refused to show the slightest sign of life. His strength ebbing, the Rottenführer gave a grunt of defeat and dismounted the motorcycle. Without a word of warning, he turned to run towards the waiting cars, leaving me alone in the sidecar. It would be fair to say that I was beginning to panic when I followed his example. As we ran down the hill, one of our cars, an open-top affair, sped up to meet us. It braked sharply and spun round to face downhill, engine racing. The anxious driver moved off before we had the chance to climb in, but the men in the back pulled us aboard as we ran alongside. At the company command post, the Rottenführer and I reported the loss of our vehicle and expensive camera. I was not at all surprised when an officer ordered us to attempt to recover the equipment later that night. 2 Kameraden from another platoon waited in the front seats of the car that rescued us earlier in the day. "In this moonlight, we won't need lights," said the driver. "The Russians won't see us coming." We drove through the inky blue shadows cast by the hills until we came to the rise beyond which we hoped our motorcycle still stood. The driver switched off the engine as we neared the crest of the hill, allowing the incline to bring the car to a quiet halt. The clicks of the handbrake as it pulled over its ratchet shot through the silence like rifle fire. "We should turn the car," whispered the driver. "We don't want to make more noise by starting the engine." The Rottenführer and I clambered out of the back seat and heaved the car back and forth across the width of the road until it pointed downhill, ready to make our getaway. Breathless from the effort of pushing the car, we made our way to the crest of the hill to see our motorcycle still exactly where we had abandoned it. Had it been booby-trapped? Were the Russians waiting, ready to fire at us as soon as we reached the motorcycle? These were my thoughts as I climbed into the sidecar with the Rottenführer already heaving on the kickstart. A throaty roar ripped into the stillness of the night. The Rottenführer spun the machine around and we sped off unscathed. My guardian angel had returned. With shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, we passed an isolated farmhouse before continuing across a rolling meadow inhabited by twittering larks. Only a few months earlier, in the deepest cold of winter, these handsome little birds flocked around roads and tracks picking at the tiniest morsels uncovered by our passing vehicles. Boris whistled a melody he had grown fond of while stationed in France. "Du hast Glück bei den Frauen, bel ami." The sudden zip of bullets brought grunts from unlucky Kameraden. I dived for cover. The Oberscharführer in charge of the patrol, the red-faced farmer from Austria who had shown us the beauties of Paris, risked everything to get a fix on the enemy through his binoculars. Our sharpshooters began to trouble the enemy machine gunners with rifle fire. As if immersed in a lurid nightmare, I crawled towards the spot where I had last seen Boris. My heart sank when I found him lying on his back in the long grass. Bright red blood drenched his legs. His fingers trembled. Bullets had shattered both thigh bones. I called out, "Sonny, Sonny." Moments later, though it seemed an age, 2 medics arrived with a stretcher. The machine gun fire stopped as suddenly as it began. Perhaps our marksman had scored a decisive hit. During the lull, we set up a defensive line while the medics evacuated our wounded to the farmhouse. Soon, Russian infantry arrived on the scene and began firing on us with rifles and mortars from the safety of a low ridge. The Russian machine gun found a new lease of life, harassing us with a stream of explosive bullets. We were in a vulnerable position. Our Oberscharführer gave the order to fall back to the farmhouse, where a large room served as a temporary hospital. Before long, the approach of Russian infantry with tank support interrupted the treatment of our wounded. Without anti-tank weapons or armour of our own, we were sitting ducks. The Oberscharführer made the agonizing decision to evacuate the farmhouse without taking the badly wounded with us. A few of us offered to hold the building until reinforcements arrived, but our Oberscharführer took the view that we would be quickly overwhelmed by the superior strength of the Russians. It was with a feeling of abject helplessness that I said goodbye to Boris. At first light, we set off with the support of machine guns and mortars, and soon retook the ground lost the previous day. News soon spread that the Russians had murdered the wounded we had left behind. Since Boris and I were in the same Kompanietrupp, the call to report to the farmhouse to identify his body came as no surprise. In the makeshift hospital ward, the sickly smell of stale blood hung in the warm air. Flies buzzed in zigzag flight, waiting for their chance to feed or lay their eggs. A camarade from a mortar crew was already present. For a moment we stood together in a festering silence, staring at the bodies, at the squashed testicles scattered across the floor. "The bastards, the fucking bastards," he snarled. His anger overflowing, he kicked out at a table, sending the basin on top crashing to the floor. "Look," he said, pointing to a body, naked from the waist down. The bastards sliced off his bollocks, everything. "Look at the amount of blood. They were still alive when they were mutilated." "I can see it as if I was there," I said. The Russians forced them to witness the torture of their Kameraden until their own turn came along. In the corner of the room was a heap of men, their heads cleaved open to the eyes by a blow that might have come from a heavy axe. "At least they didn't suffer too long," said my companion. "They were in a hurry when they did that," I speculated. Then I found Boris. The handles of the pliers from his toolkit, just visible inside his gaping mouth, stretched his cheeks into a gruesome smile. The tips of the metal jaws penetrated his windpipe and were visible through the stretched skin of his neck. He must have slowly and painfully choked to death. Such are the horrors of war, but still, after all these years, an icy shudder runs down my spine when I think of the torture of my Kameraden. We laughed when we first saw them, the Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes crop dusters, nothing but cloth stretched over a slight timber frame, braced by strands of wire and powered by engines that clattered as if cobbled together from parts scavenged from a junkyard. When I first heard them, they brought to mind an image of my mother, her feet working the treadle of her sewing machine, and hands industriously feeding the workpiece under the needle. We came to dread the sound of these Nähmaschinen, sewing machines as we called them. They were tough little birds that could take rifle or machine gun fire with apparent impunity. In a favourable wind, they flew so slowly they appeared to hover. Surprisingly, the low airspeed of the Nähmaschinen was no great disadvantage. Our Mi-109S risked talling if they tried to match their speed and flashed past before they were able to take proper aim. By the time they returned for a second pass, the Russian pilots had often skillfully manoeuvred their aircraft out of harm's way. At night, the rattle of their engines would stop suddenly, as if the aircraft had been spirited from the darkness. Then, like hunting owls, they swooped, their bracing wires hissing through the air, a prelude to a storm of shrapnel from fragmentation bombs that burst without first whistling a warning. These attacks drained our strength not only by inflicting casualties, but also by denying us precious sleep. The female pilots of these infernal machines soon earned the epithet Nachthexen, witches of the night. At dawn, we found ourselves at the exposed edge of a high plateau overlooking a road junction defended by two of the omnipresent T-34S. As we waited for our next orders, 3 black specks appeared in the sky beyond the tanks. Dipping close to the treetops, they disappeared from sight, hidden by their camouflage. "The bitches will be on top of us soon," cursed a camarade. Expecting a fragmentation bomb attack, we took what cover we could. The tinny rattle of the plane's engines took on a laboured note, dragging the aircraft above the plateau, before easing back to a contented purr. Our sporadic rifle and machine gun fire did nothing to deter the attack. A liquid, poured from canisters, fell from the planes. It turned first to white smoke, then to cascading pellets of fire. Where they landed, the dry grass caught light. The cry went up, "Phosphorus." Several pellets hit a fellow close by. He screamed dreadfully as the inextinguishable fire sizzled into his skin. Experience had taught us that even relatively minor phosphorus burns could bring a lingering death. As the rattling of the Russian plane's engines faded into the distance, our Oberscharführer called for volunteers to tackle the tanks at the road junction. I immediately stepped forward with the Rottenführer and Unterscharführer, both from the same company trupp to which I belonged. These chaps were a few years older and kept themselves apart from the rest of us less experienced soldiers, probably as a survival ploy. Equipped with machine pistols and stick grenades pushed into our belts, we set off towards the tanks on a Zündapp motorcycle and sidecar. As a recently promoted Sturmmann, I held the lowest rank and could only listen as my 2 companions discussed their strategy to deal with the tanks as we rolled downhill. "We should keep it simple," shouted the Rottenführer into the ear of the driver, "park the motorbike out of sight of the tanks, and move in on foot to get a closer look." As the Unterscharführer guided the motorcycle round a sharp bend, he looked at me and gave a crazy cackle. At last, a chance to earn the tank destruction stripe. "I'll stay with the bike in case we need to make a quick getaway," he offered generously. "You two can deal with the tanks." The Rottenführer and I left the motorcycle sitting under a copse of small trees and made our way to within 50 metres of the tanks. We listened for Russian voices, but heard only the lazy hum of flying insects as the air around the 2 Mickey Mouse T-34 tanks shimmered in the sunshine. Likening this model of Russian tank to Mickey Mouse was no criticism of their quality of construction. It was simply an amusing reference to their appearance when they had both turret hatches open. "Remember," the Rottenführer whispered, "we have to time this perfectly. Take out both tanks at the same time." I nodded, then wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. We'll work our way round the rear to make sure there are no footsloggers nearby. Stick close to me." Keeping to natural dips in the ground and the cover of long grass, we crawled on our bellies until only a 20-metre stretch of open road separated us from our goal. Resting on one knee, the Rottenführer slung the strap of his machine pistol across his shoulder and calmly pushed his 2 stick grenades deeper between his belt and body. "Make sure you don't drop them," he said, couching now like a cat about to spring on an unsuspecting mouse. Instinctively, I followed his example. For a brief moment, his pale blue eyes fixed on mine as if to confirm that I had the courage to follow. "The one on the other side of the road's yours. See you back at the motorbike," said the Rottenführer before leaping from our hiding place. I sprinted to my appointed target. Heart pounding, I grabbed a handle on the sloping rear of the tank and clambered up to the flat area above the engine behind the turret. My fingers trembled as I unscrewed the metal cap on the end of the grenade handle to expose the porcelain tugball and lanyard that would ignite the delay fuse. With the grenade in one hand, I grasped the handle of a turret hatch with the other, yanking it forward. The tank crew had become careless. They were fast asleep at their posts. I tugged the lanyard and let the grenade fall into the tank. It landed on the lap of a crew member. Mouth agape, he looked up at me as I slammed down the hatch. I can only imagine the panic he must have felt as the grenade's delay fuse marked down his final few seconds. A rocket of flame shot from the turret of the Rottenführer's tank as I leapt to the ground. A blast of sound and heat from behind sent me staggering forwards as my own target exploded from within. Everything had gone exactly to plan, and it was with a feeling of intense elation that I arrived back at the waiting Zündab. I had fulfilled the criteria required to earn the tank destruction stripe, the annihilation, without assistance, of an enemy tank. Pleased with our work, we returned to company headquarters to report the details our successful exploit to an officer. But, he explained, there was a problem. There had been only 2 Russian tanks, and 3 of us had been involved in their destruction. The rules stated quite clearly, he said, that only one Panzervernichtungsabzeichen, a cloth stripe carrying a metal symbol of a tank, could be granted for the destruction of each tank. I learned shortly afterwards that the Rottenführer and Unterscharführer were awarded these coveted stripes, while I was given only a vague hint that my role in the demolition of the tanks would be duly recognized. On a particularly hot day in early June, a message circulated by field telephone warned that our Pioneer Corps had neutralized a poison gas shell. As a precaution, we put on the gas masks we carried in aluminium cylinders. Since the shell had landed only a short distance from where I had dug in, I decided to take a closer look at it. Split in half along its length, it oozed a brown liquid, but, as far as I know, no one was harmed by it. Nevertheless, our commanders radioed the Russians to complain about their use of gas. By the strange etiquette of war on the Ostfront, they received a prompt apology for the erroneous use of the gas shell. We in turn declared our displeasure with a storm of rockets from our Nebelwerfers. On arching trails of smoke, our rockets screamed towards a hill a few kilometers ahead of our front lines. The 6 rockets from a single launcher would strike a small area at 1-second intervals, with devastating consequences for anyone caught in the open. When we advanced through the enemy position, I saw at first hand the devastating effect of our bombardment. Russian soldiers wearing the smart blue uniforms and gold-buckled boots of Stalin's elite guard slumped against their artillery pieces in poses that suggested they might continue loading their weapons at any moment. There was no blood, no mutilated corpses. The concussive effect of the high explosive in the Nebelwerfer rockets had killed them as they stood. A few days later, I took command of 2 machine gun crews. Ehlers and Koenig were also transferred to machine gun duties, so I didn't feel too much like a stranger among the Kameraden of my new platoon.